Science Minds. I'm really pleased today to be joined by Steve Hinshaw. So thank you so much for having us, hosting us here, and yeah, I'm excited to talk with you a little bit. This is actually a little bit different of a Science Minds than others because we're shooting this after your DLS talk, which was excellent. I had a chance to look through it and really just I have a lot of questions that I'm very interested in regarding your work. But before we get into that, I want to talk about your background a little bit. You brought up in your talk sort of your inspiration coming into the field of psychology really came from your father. Right. And I'd just love to kind of hear a little bit more about about your trajectory and that influence on where you are now.
Seemingly, it was an idyllic childhood. Columbus, Ohio. Dad was a professor of philosophy at Ohio State. Mom was a lecturer in English and history. And my little sister and I had 50-yard line seats with our family at Ohio Stadium to watch the mighty Buckeyes. Excellent public schools. But Dad would be gone. I mean, vanished for 3 months, 6 months, or at one point a year at a time. Nothing was said. Didn't know if he was alive or dead. What I didn't know as a kid was that his lead doctor at OSU had said, if your children ever learn of your severe mental illness, they thought it was schizophrenia, he was misdiagnosed for about 40 years, they'll be permanently destroyed. You and your wife are forbidden from ever mentioning the subject. So the doctor's orders were in the 50s or 60s, mental illness is so devastating, it's so toxic, you can never bring it up. So what do kids do in a family when things are not going so well, but nobody talks about it? Well, I guess there's two choices. A kid can believe the world's a random, cruel place, not a very happy or healthy attribution. Or the kid might think, well, maybe it's my fault, maintaining a semblance of control, even though the kid really doesn't have control. But then at least the world might be predictable. School and sports were my refuge. Dad would appear mysteriously out of the blue one day. No one talked about where he'd been. Everybody pretended that things were just fine. And it wasn't until I escaped Ohio to go to New England for college. I came back home for my first spring break, and my dad pulled me aside. I had turned 18 in the interim, and said, son, perhaps you should come into my study, my library at home, and I'll tell you something of my past. So I didn't know what to think, because our family didn't talk about important stuff. Didn't know that there was doctor's orders not to. And he told me about his first episode in the 30s when he jumped off the roof of his Pasadena home thinking he had wings and could fly. And this was to send a message to the free world's leaders to save the free world from the Nazis, the fascists. And I kind of had this eerie feeling that I was hearing the truth for the first time. It was somewhat terrifying, but also a relief because I knew something that serious must have been happening for all this silence. And he told me about his other hospitalizations, what it was like to be a professor of philosophy and to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the medications he'd taken and the electroshock therapies he'd had, which of course he wouldn't have needed those treatments had he been diagnosed correctly. So I went back to my undergraduate institution, Harvard, and changed my major to psychology within 2 weeks. Because as terrified as I was, now I had a mission, which is to learn about mental illness and maybe save my dad from some of the really tough experiences he'd had. But they were intermixed with, he was a brilliant philosopher at grad school at Princeton. He'd studied with Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell. And so his life was kind of a bipolar life, as befitting the bipolar disorder I helped him get the proper diagnosis of just a few years later. And so ever since, doing a lot of volunteer work in college, working on research projects, taking 3 years out before going to grad school to get experience with schools and kids with many severe physical and mental disabilities, the idea was to learn about causes and treatments, and ultimately to fight the stigma that had enshrouded our family for my first 18 years.
Wow, that's an amazing background, an amazing story. Where does the link happen between sort of that background and girls with ADHD?
Right.
How do you get to that point?
Well, some things in life are a little random. You can't always predict. So I think I identified in college with kind of being a lost, somewhat lonely kid. I was a big brother. I taught at a prison in the Massachusetts system with a couple of other undergrads. I worked at the Cambridge Mental Health Center for a couple of kids. There was a psychiatrist and a social worker and a psychologist, and then the undergrad would make a home visit a couple times a week to get to know the family a little more intimately. And I identified with kids who had lost their way. I worked with a professor, Bruce Baker, who is now retired from UCLA, who moved out west many years back. And I got interested in developmental disabilities. And I have relatives with some pretty severe developmental disabilities, thinking that this was the time of normalization and the Scandinavian movement for living as close as possible to everyday realities rather than in large institutions like the ones my dad had been in. And finally decided to go to grad school in clinical psychology to work with kids and teens and young adults and families and learn about genes and about schools and home life. And when I went to grad school at UCLA, I paired up with Professor Barbara Henker, who sadly passed away a few years ago, and she was doing summer camps on hyperkinetic boys. That's what they were called before ADD and ADHD kind of took over the lingo. And to me, interested in genetic risk and in family processes and in a lot of peer development, ADHD, as it came to be called, has a huge genetic liability, but also how you're raised, how you're schooled, how your self-perceptions develop have a lot to do with outcome. So to me, it was a kind of fascinating laboratory for someone interested in biology and genetics and psychosocial processes. And you can really help kids with ADHD. A lot of success stories. And it was only years later when I became a professor at Berkeley that I always wondered why, well, we'd have, for our summer camp programs and our treatment studies, we'd have tons of boys apply and a handful of girls. I wrote a grant to the National Institute of Mental Health saying, let's do a big study of girls with ADHD and maybe we can follow them up long term. And after one unsuccessful try, got a really good grant score on our second time. And we started the Berkeley Girls with ADHD Longitudinal Study, the BGAL study. You got to have a good acronym. And we've learned a lot that I think and hope has shaped the field to understand that just as with autism spectrum disorders, ADHD can and does exist in girls. And when it does, clinicians may miss it. And if there's not good early intervention, there can be a heap of trouble later on.
It was really interesting to hear you, speak about this study and think about, you've been at it for over 25 years with this cohort, right. And, ADHD, like you have also spoken about just now, is, name changes, hyperkinetic disorder, right. Attention deficit disorder, all these iterations and growth in how we think of ADHD. And I'm interested to know and just kind of hear your thoughts about how sort of public perception, kind of like the pop culture ADHD world, has interacted with what you've done over the years, ebbing and flowing, thinking about really like the ADHD epidemic in the, in the 90s, yeah. And how that has sort of influenced you, maybe how you've had to fight against it, just that interaction I'm really curious about over the years.
There's a lot of facets to your question, and I'll mention a couple. I did note in the talk at Davis that the American public now knows far more about ADHD, autism spectrum conditions, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD than a half century ago. There's high school psychology courses. I certainly never had one of those in my public school in Ohio all those decades ago. And it's everywhere in social media. But with knowledge of symptoms, stigma has hardly budged. In fact, 3 times more Americans than in the 50s, if they hear the term mental illness, think automatically of dangerousness and violence and aggression. So we've got a long way to go to bridge knowledge and attitudes. ADHD for a long time was kind of the Tom Sawyer syndrome, the obstreperous boy acting out in class and not wanting to whitewash Aunt Polly's fence. And we now know that ADHD afflicts girls not quite as much as boys, but a good number of them. And when a girl has ADHD, the underlying executive dysfunction and self-regulatory problems persist because some of the hyperactivity that boys have or girls may have kind of fades with time. So public attitudes in some ways are more accepting. ADHD is a real thing, but it's also the source of ridicule because we know that these kids just aren't really trying hard and their parents have spoiled them and been too permissive, and medications are probably just poisons. Why would you put a stimulant in the developing brain of a young child? So the information and misinformation in today's social media whirl are a mess of reduced stigma, still doubting that it's a real condition. But if you're a girl with ADHD, well, that's really gender atypical. Girls are supposed to get along with others. Girls are supposed to do well in school. So the stigma for girls, and girls of color in particular, or girls without many means, we get double and triple stigmas. And one of the goals of my research is to not only learn about neurodevelopment, learn about treatment and causes and how to put the pieces together, but also find the best ways to fundamentally change public opinion.
Another aspect of your work, and this brings kind of dovetails with this idea of stigma, is what you have termed like heterogeneous continuity.
Mm-hmm. Heterotypic continuity.
Heterotypic continuity, excuse
Right.
me. So I'm really interested in these trajectories, and I was thinking a lot about, how your outcomes have changed over the years as these girls have become women and are continuing to develop, and you talk a lot about aspects of puberty, aspects of like childbirth, those kinds of things throughout development. And I'm interested in the trajectory that you see as now, you said that your sample is in their 30s, mm-hmm. and starting to think about families, right. Starting to think about those kinds of dynamics and how ADHD relates to that, but also how stigma relates to that. And I'm really curious about your thoughts on that as this sample is aging now.
ADHD has a stereotype again. It's a guy thing. It's a white middle class guy thing, unlike the reality that it can well be a gal thing. It can equal opportunity across race, ethnicity, and class. The other stereotype is you can't pay attention. Well, that's a misnomer. Hyperfocus. People with ADHD, if it's a really intrinsically rewarding task, and they're really into it, can't shut it off for hour after hour. Oh, wait, what about dinner? What about sleep? What about my chores? What about my family? ADHD is a problem with the regulation of attention throughout a day as situations and tasks and demands change. So as a self-regulatory disorder, one might think, and this is what our lab thinks a lot about, is that as development ensues, as you go from preschool to grade school to secondary school to work to post-secondary education to close relationships, formation of sexual encounters, etc., that the underlying self-regulatory deficit is going to show up in somewhat different ways over time. It's not about sitting still in a classroom the way you had to in second and third and fourth grade. What we've learned is that girls with ADHD, just like boys with ADHD, really do suffer academically, some because of a specific learning disability, but more because of poor organizational and planning skills. Girls with ADHD, even more than boys, have real problems with peer relationships because girls don't quite understand why this girl isn't cooperative and why she interrupts all the time, doesn't quite read my social cues well. And unlike boys with ADHD, who tend to be more externalizing, aggressive, feisty, girls with ADHD, especially during the teen years, puberty, secondary school, the confusing social cultural mores about how you're supposed to look and how you're supposed to act, If you feel as a girl with ADHD that you're not meeting standards, well, it must be your fault. It's that internalization. So one of the heterotypically continuous pathways we're quite concerned about is an early transition, especially for girls with ADHD. It happens for all girls these days in shocking numbers. Cutting, self-mutilating, burning, all the way to intensive thoughts about suicide and attempted suicide. ADHD in girls is a huge risk factor. It's also a risk factor for unplanned pregnancy, for being sexually assaulted or being the victim of what we call intimate partner violence. And now we're just finishing looking at our cohort when they're in their 30s, slowed by the pandemic, as a lot of research programs have been. And we're hoping to see more signs of resilience for those who've made it out relatively unscathed by their ADHD, or even those who've suffered a lot from it. What are the ways of coping? Who are the people in their lives? What are the organizational skills they learned? Is medication still helpful later on? We got a bevy of information we're going to unlock the key on and start to analyze this summer to see if we can find some pathways to resilience.
Looking back at this study, what is one thing that you wish that you may have done differently, or to answer a specific question, to be able to answer a question?
Well, it's a simple question. Why didn't I have a crystal ball in 1996 and 7? Why didn't we know more then about some of the measures it would have been important to uncover? Well, we could have started earlier, infancy and toddlerhood, but that would have been practically impossible. But if only we had measured some of the early neighborhood factors, gotten a view and a glimpse of videotaping inside homes and inside classrooms. But it's always a balance. You learn when you do prospective longitudinal research how little you knew when that study started. And maybe you can beat yourself up about that. But many instances of our outcome domains, we keep exactly the same measures. Mm-hmm. Maybe the young women are reporting on it now, unlike their parents earlier. If you want to measure change, you don't want to change the measure. That's called a confound. But then you prune, just like the brain prunes, and we've added measures of self-harm and intimate relationships and more difficult executive function tasks. So the same ones, but also some additional more difficult ones, because we want to measure predictions from the same measures over time, but we also want to be ahead of the developmental curve and have the most sensitive measures of life outcomes as the sample matures.
Yeah. What about kind of looking into the future of your research program or the field more broadly excites you?
Integration. What did we think not so many decades ago? Autism was caused by refrigerator parents. Schizophrenia was caused by the schizophrenic mother, hostile, aloof, demanding. The kid had to sort of devise an alternate reality to escape those kind of impossible binds. ADHD was clearly caused by ineffective parenting or lax parenting. The parents never set any limits. Now we know that schizophrenia, autism spectrum, ADHD all have substantial heritabilities. Genes explain most of the risk for why I may be very fidgety and inattentive and you may be very calm. But the field moves in phases. It's all about parenting to it's all about genes and the twin and adoption studies. And now we're at a place where we know that there's not one gene, there's not 50, there's not 100, there may be thousands of genes acting in concert with one another that propel the risk for ASDs, ADHD, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and it's early prenatal environments, it's early home environments and school environments that unleash those genes at different points in time for people with different levels of genetic risk. We're in the both and world. What I look forward to and I'm most excited about is integration, not reductionism.
Absolutely. Well, that's a really promising and hopeful outlook. And it's fun to be an early scientist now and see that confluence happening every day. So the work that you're doing is just phenomenal, and it's so just cool to see their trajectories. And
well, I appreciate it. And some days I wake up and think, boy, we do know a lot more than some decades ago. And other days, look at the epidemic of mental health problems in young people, especially girls, especially coming out of the pandemic. Suicide rates have never been higher in our country for girls and young women and kids of color. Adults between year 1 and year 2 of the pandemic kind of returned to baseline. Kids have never returned to baseline. School achievement issues, not having the structures, fighting the world of disinformation and climate change and how to form identity. So we don't use a lot of physical therapy in our lab for patting ourselves on the back, because it's good to note progress, but we're continually inspired, if not depressed, by how big the problem is ahead of us.
Yeah. Well, I was going to end, but you just keep giving me good ideas and questions. My last question here is, where do you feel like the biggest lever is for individuals? You know, where do you put the funding? Where do you put the effort and the focus that you think is going to have the most impact for people?
Yeah, I was afraid you'd ask. No, I'm glad you asked that. Because complicated problems like climate change are not going to be solved by carbon taxes or policies or recycle. It's going to take a combination of many, many things. And the same is true for mental and neurodevelopmental disorders and for reducing stigma. We've got to enforce the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We've got to get kids the right kinds of accommodations so they have a chance of succeeding in school and then later on the job. We also need to think very hard about not just developing treatments. We've got some pretty effective treatments. Medications, when they're prescribed well, can really help. Behavioral treatments, cognitive behavioral treatments, organizational skills, family interventions. So I'll make a point that I think I made briefly in the talk. What was one of the most stigmatized conditions on earth 30 or 40 years ago? HIV/AIDS. And once the antiretrovirals came in the 90s, stigma plummeted because there was hope of, if not a cure, of really good treatment. Give you a lot of productive years ahead. One of the biggest levers is promoting and disseminating treatments that we know work to communities who don't have access to them. Everybody wins. Then we get on a virtuous cycle of people thrive, stigma reduces, and there's more hope for the future generations.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down and having this conversation with me.
Great.
It was really, really awesome.
Could go on for longer, but yeah. I don't think we have that many hours.
Well, I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
You.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with the promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.